My father always believed he owned my future. He spoke of my life as if it were his business deal, and I was just another contract to sign. The day he told me I would marry a woman I barely knew, a woman I could not stand, my world stopped breathing. I wasn't asked what I wanted. I wasn't asked who I loved. My voice meant nothing, only his pride, his name, his empire. I remember sitting there, staring at him, wanting to scream, but my lips stayed frozen. My heart wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was trapped. And the cruelest part? The woman I was being forced to marry, she hated me just as much as I hated her, yet somehow, that was only the beginning. My father had always been a man of power, the kind of man whose words carried weight like chains, heavy and unbreakable. When he spoke, no one argued. When he decided, no one questioned. My life had never been mine, not really. I was raised under his shadow, walking a path he had carved for me long before I ever learned how to dream for myself. Every step I took, every choice I thought I made, was secretly chosen by him. He believed his authority was love, that control was protection, but to me, it felt like a cage. And the day he announced my marriage, not as a request but as a command, I realized just how little I mattered in his world. I was not his daughter. I was his pawn. He called me into his study that evening. The room smelled of leather and cigars, filled with the weight of silence. His eyes, sharp and cold, watched me like I was a soldier waiting for orders. He didn't waste time with kindness. "You will marry her," he said, his voice calm but final. No explanation. No discussion. Just a verdict. My chest tightened. I could feel the blood rushing to my face, the ground beneath me threatening to break apart. My lips parted, ready to protest, but his eyes dared me to speak. They dared me to defy him. And I knew what would happen if I did. I had grown up watching his punishments, his anger disguised as discipline. I had seen what happened to anyone who challenged his authority. So I swallowed my words, even as they burned my throat like fire. The woman's name fell from his mouth like a hammer. I had met her once before, long ago, and even then, I could not stand her. She was proud, sharp-tongued, with an air of superiority that grated against everything inside me. Our one brief encounter had ended with her dismissive laughter, as if I were beneath her, as if my presence was a nuisance. That memory came back now with unbearable clarity, and I wanted to scream that I would rather live alone forever than share a life with her. But I stayed silent, because silence was the only armor I had left. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside my window. I felt the weight of a life I didn't choose pressing down on me, suffocating me. I thought of the girl I had once loved, the one I had never told my father about. I remembered her smile, soft and free, a reminder of who I really was beneath the mask my father forced me to wear. She was the kind of love that made my heart light, the kind of love that made me believe I deserved happiness. But that love had been stolen from me long before this moment, crushed under the pressure of a family name that demanded obedience. And now, he wanted me to replace it with a marriage built not on love, but on convenience. The thought of waking up next to someone I couldn't stand filled me with dread. The thought of holding her hand for photographs, of wearing a smile that wasn't real, of pretending to be what I wasn't, made me sick. But worst of all was the thought that this wasn't temporary. This wasn't a nightmare I could wake from. This was my reality. My father had chosen it, and to him, my heart, my dreams, my freedom, none of it mattered. He had already decided what my life would look like, and I was too small, too powerless, to stop him. I cried quietly that night, burying my face in the pillow so no one would hear. The tears weren't just for the marriage. They were for every moment I had swallowed my voice, every piece of myself I had hidden, every dream I had abandoned because I was too afraid to defy him. My soul felt bruised, like it had been beaten for years without ever healing. And now, with this marriage, it felt like the final wound, the one that would never close. When morning came, the world looked the same, but I didn't. I had aged overnight. My reflection in the mirror showed a woman who no longer belonged to herself. I stared at my own eyes, searching for strength, for defiance, but all I saw was exhaustion. Still, somewhere deep inside, a small spark flickered. A whisper reminding me that even in a cage, a heart could beat with rebellion. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I knew one thing: I could not live like this forever. Something had to change. That spark, though faint, was the only comfort I carried with me as I stepped out of my room and prepared to face the life my father had forced into my hands. The wedding day came faster than I expected, as if the universe itself wanted to see me trapped. I woke that morning with a weight in my chest that made it hard to breathe. My body felt heavy, but my heart felt hollow, drained of every trace of hope. The house was buzzing with preparations, relatives moving like shadows through hallways, voices echoing with excitement that didn't belong to me. Their laughter and joy made me feel like a ghost in my own life, invisible except for the role I had been assigned. I was the bride, but I felt like the sacrifice. The dress they made me wear was beautiful, too beautiful for the misery inside me. White silk flowed around me, heavy with embroidery and pearls, a gown fit for royalty. Everyone who looked at me saw a vision of elegance, but when I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw chains. The smile they pinned on my lips was nothing but a lie, and I hated how convincing it looked. I wanted to tear the fabric apart, to scream and run barefoot through the streets, but my father's presence was everywhere. His eyes lingered even when he wasn't in the room. His control lived in the silence, in the walls, in the very air I breathed. When I walked into the ceremony hall, my steps felt like they belonged to someone else. Every footfall echoed in my head, each one taking me closer to a destiny I never wanted. My gaze fell upon her, the woman who would become my wife in name, though in truth she was a stranger I could barely tolerate. She stood across the aisle, dressed in a gown just as breathtaking, but her face carried the same emptiness I felt. Her lips pressed into a thin, resentful line, her eyes narrowed in quiet defiance. For a brief second, I saw something I hadn't expected, resentment not aimed at me, but at the world that had shoved us both into this prison. It didn't soften me, though. If anything, it made me ache more, because we were both victims, yet we couldn't even find comfort in each other's pain. The vows were recited like lines from a play. Words of love and commitment that meant nothing spilled from our mouths. My throat burned as I repeated them, each word tasting like ash. Her voice was steady, but cold, each syllable edged with disdain. There was no tenderness in her tone, no flicker of affection. When the priest declared us married, the applause of the guests thundered in my ears, but all I felt was silence. It was as if the world had cheered while burying me alive. My hand was forced into hers, and for the first time, I felt the touch of my wife's skin against mine. It wasn't warm. It wasn't kind. It was rigid, a handshake between two unwilling soldiers signing a peace treaty neither wanted. The reception blurred around me. Smiling faces, clinking glasses, meaningless speeches. People congratulated us as if this union were a blessing, as if love had brought us together. Their ignorance burned me inside. I nodded, I thanked them, I performed the role expected of me. But every time I turned toward her, I saw the same emptiness mirrored in her eyes. We avoided conversation, speaking only when we had to, our words curt and sharp like knives. We moved together for photographs, our shoulders brushing, but even in those forced touches there was distance, like two magnets pushed against their natural pull. When the night grew quiet and the guests left, the silence between us deepened. We sat across from each other in the grand bedroom prepared for us, a room filled with roses and candles, as if the world thought romance could be forced into existence. Neither of us spoke at first. The air was thick, suffocating, heavy with unspoken resentment. Finally, she broke the silence. Her voice was low, but firm. I didn't want this either. The honesty in her tone startled me, though her words did not. I looked at her then, really looked, and saw the exhaustion behind her perfect appearance, the bitterness carved into her expression. She was as much a prisoner as I was. That truth should have comforted me, but it didn't. Instead, it deepened the wound. Knowing she despised the marriage as much as I did meant there was no chance of finding even a fragile thread of affection to hold on to. We were not partners, we were co-captives in the same cage. Her presence reminded me of my lack of freedom, her face a constant reflection of the father who had placed us here. I turned away from her, whispering only, "Then we endure it." It was the only agreement we had that night, lying in that bed, inches apart yet worlds away. I closed my eyes and let the weight of the day crush me. I thought of the little girl I once was, the one who used to believe in love, who used to dream of a life filled with laughter and freedom. That girl was gone, buried beneath silk and diamonds and her father's command. Beside me lay a stranger who carried the same burden, but her presence brought me no comfort. It only made the emptiness feel louder, like an echo in my chest. The silence between us spoke louder than words ever could. This was not a beginning. It was an ending. An ending to choice, to freedom, to love. And yet, somewhere deep in the ache of my chest, I feared it was only the first step into something far heavier than I could imagine. The first weeks of married life felt like walking through a storm without an umbrella. Every corner of the house carried silence that was louder than words, thick enough to choke me. We lived under the same roof, shared the same walls, even the same bed, yet it felt as though there was an invisible wall of glass between us. We could see each other, but we could not reach through. I woke up each morning to the sound of her moving about the room, her footsteps sharp and deliberate, as if she wanted me to know she was awake but not to dare speak. I kept my eyes closed most mornings, pretending to sleep, just so I could avoid her gaze. Meals were the worst. We sat at the dining table, an endless stretch of polished wood between us, our plates filled with food we barely touched. The clinking of forks against porcelain was the only music of those moments. Sometimes she would glance at me, and I would catch the flicker of annoyance in her eyes before she quickly looked away. Other times, I felt her watching me when she thought I wasn't paying attention, her expression unreadable, her face calm but her jaw tight as though she carried a storm behind her lips. I hated those silent stares because they made me feel exposed, as if she was searching for my weakness. The arguments began small, like sparks falling from flint. One evening, she criticized the way I had folded the laundry. "If you're going to do it properly," she said, her tone clipped, her hand snatching the clothes from mine. Her words stung, not because of the laundry but because of the way she said them, like I was nothing more than a child fumbling in her world. I snapped back without thinking, telling her that if she wanted it done a certain way, she should do it herself. That was the first of many clashes. We argued over trivial things, how to arrange the books, where to place the dishes, who should handle the bills. But beneath those shallow disputes was something deeper, a river of resentment neither of us dared to name. Every harsh word was a reminder that we had been forced into this, that our anger wasn't really about laundry or dishes, but about the chains on our hands and the walls closing in around us. Still, in the middle of the bitterness, I began to notice things about her. She carried herself with such pride, as though she refused to bend no matter how strong the wind. There was a precision in the way she moved, the way she organized her world, like she needed control over something because everything else had been taken from her. I saw her late at night sitting by the window, her face lit by the pale moonlight, her eyes fixed on the sky. There was loneliness in her silence, a loneliness I recognized because it mirrored my own. And though I tried to ignore it, though I told myself I despised her, I couldn't stop wondering what thoughts kept her awake at night, what ghosts haunted her when she thought no one was watching. One evening, after another quiet dinner, I gathered the courage to ask her about her family. Her reaction startled me. Her face hardened, her fork clattered onto the plate, and she said sharply, "Don't." The way her voice cracked at the end of that word told me more than any explanation could have. She hated them. She hated them as much as I hated my father. For the first time, I saw not just arrogance in her, but pain. A raw wound hidden beneath layers of pride. I didn't press further, but something inside me shifted. She was not just my enemy. She was also someone's daughter, someone's prisoner, someone scarred by the same kind of control that had ruined me. The nights grew heavier after that realization. I lay in bed, inches away from her, listening to her steady breathing. Sometimes, in the darkness, I thought I heard her sigh, soft and tired, as though her heart was carrying more than it could hold. I wanted to reach out, to ask her what haunted her, but my pride kept me still. I was afraid that if I tried to touch her world, she would shove me back into my own. Yet the curiosity gnawed at me. The more I saw her guarded silence, the more I wondered what was hidden behind it. One night, as rain lashed against the windows, she spoke suddenly into the darkness. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Her voice was quiet, almost fragile, so unlike the sharpness she carried in the daylight. My chest tightened, because the truth was I thought about it every single day. But I didn't answer right away. I stared into the ceiling, heart racing, unsure if her words were a test or a confession. Finally, I whispered, "All the time." She turned her head then, her eyes catching mine in the dim glow of the street lights outside. For a moment, the wall of glass between us cracked. We were no longer enemies, no longer strangers forced into a cage, but two wounded souls trapped in the same storm, whispering into the night about a freedom neither of us had. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was different, softer, almost like a truce. For the first time since the wedding, I felt like we weren't just enduring each other. We were enduring together. And though I still carried anger, though the bitterness hadn't disappeared, I couldn't deny the truth. Something between us had shifted. Something I couldn't yet name, but something I couldn't ignore. I had always imagined that love would come into my life like sunlight, warm and gentle, something that made everything glow brighter. But in those first months of marriage, all I felt was darkness. Yet slowly, like cracks in a wall letting in faint rays, something began to change. I didn't notice it at first. It started with moments so small I could have brushed them aside, but each one lodged itself into me, refusing to be ignored. It happened one evening at a family gathering. The kind of event where appearances mattered more than truth, where everyone smiled through gritted teeth, pretending life was perfect. I had been standing alone, trying to blend into the wallpaper, when one of my father's old associates approached me. His words were polite on the surface, but the way his eyes lingered on me, the condescending way he spoke about my role as a wife, made my stomach twist. "You must be grateful," he said with a smirk, "to have been given such a marriage. A girl like you could not have done better." His words sliced into me, dragging out the humiliation I had carried for months. I froze, too stunned to reply, my chest tightening with shame. Before I could gather myself, she was suddenly there, my wife. Her posture was tall, her eyes sharp, her voice cutting through the air like steel. "She doesn't need your approval," she said firmly. "And she's far more than you'll ever deserve to speak to." The room fell silent for a moment, his smug expression wiped clean, and he backed away with muttered excuses. I stood there, stunned, my heart thundering in my chest. I hadn't expected her to defend me. Not her. Not the woman I thought despised me as much as I despised her. On the ride home, I kept stealing glances at her, trying to understand. She sat with her arms crossed, staring out the window, her jaw tense. I wanted to thank her, but the words stuck in my throat. Gratitude felt too fragile, too vulnerable. And yet, that night, as I lay in bed, I replayed her voice in my head. The fierceness of it. The way she had stood between me and the world, as if for a moment, I wasn't her burden but someone worth protecting. That memory stayed with me, warming the cold corners of my chest. Days passed, and I began to notice more. The way she carried herself at family dinners, never letting anyone see how much she hated being there. The way her laughter, rare as it was, sounded like something stolen and precious. The way she worked late into the night at her desk, her face lit by lamplight, determination etched into her features as if proving to herself that she had control over at least one part of her life. Each detail chipped away at the bitterness I had built around her, forcing me to admit that there was more to her than pride and sharp words. It wasn't easy to accept. My instinct was to push back, to hold on to my anger because it felt safer. But I couldn't deny the truth, I was beginning to respect her. And that respect frightened me, because respect was the first step towards something deeper, something I wasn't ready for. Still, it happened. Slowly, without my permission, I found myself watching her more than I should. I caught myself wondering what she was thinking when she stared out the window, or what dreams she buried when she turned away from me. One evening, I found her in the library, sitting on the floor surrounded by books. Her hair had fallen loose around her face, and there was something softer about her in that moment. She looked up at me, her expression guarded, but she didn't push me away when I sat across from her. For a long time, we sat in silence, the air thick with words neither of us knew how to say. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "Do you ever wonder what life could have been if none of this had happened?" I nodded, my throat tightening. "Every day." She looked at me then, really looked, and in her eyes I saw not just the woman who had mocked me once, not just the wife I had been forced to take, but a mirror of my own suffering. A soul crushed under the weight of family and expectation. That night was different. For the first time, when we went to bed, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt fragile, like glass that might shatter if we spoke too loudly. I lay awake listening to her breathing, softer now, no longer weighed down with anger. And I realized that maybe the hatred I thought I felt wasn't as strong as I believed. Maybe it had only been fear. Fear of what she represented. Fear of what I had lost. Fear of what I might feel if I let my walls down. The days that followed carried a new tension, one that was not sharp with anger but thick with curiosity. I caught myself wanting to talk to her, wanting to know more. And though neither of us admitted it, something fragile and unspoken was beginning to take shape between us. Something that unsettled me as much as it gave me hope. Nights became longer, not because I was restless but because the silence between us was no longer unbearable. It had changed, softened into something else, something uncertain but alive. I found myself listening for her movements in the dark, waiting for the creak of the floorboards when she went to pour herself water, or the way her breath would catch just before she fell asleep. One evening, without planning to, I broke the silence first. I asked her what her favorite childhood memory was. For a long moment I thought she wouldn't answer, but then her voice came, low and steady. She spoke of summers spent by the sea, of the salt in her hair and the freedom of running barefoot across sand, of a version of herself that had existed before her family had begun to dictate who she should be. There was a wistfulness in her tone, and for the first time, I felt her not as a stranger forced into my life, but as a girl who had lost something precious, just like me. After that night, conversations came more easily, though still quietly, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile thread held us together. We began to share stories in the dark. She confessed how she once loved someone, a girl whose laughter made her feel invincible. Her father had found out, and with a fury that left scars, he tore them apart. She didn't cry as she told me, but her eyes shone with a pain so sharp I could feel it slicing into me. I told her about the girl I once loved too, the one I never dared bring home, the one I let slip away because I was too afraid to fight for her. When I finished, we both sat in silence, the weight of our shared losses hanging heavy between us. And yet, in that silence, I felt less alone. Days began to look different after that. Where there had once been coldness, there was now the faint warmth of understanding. She would leave a cup of tea for me on the table in the mornings, not with a smile or a word, but with a quiet gesture that spoke louder than either. I started to notice how she lingered when I laughed, as though she was memorizing the sound. Once, when I burned my hand while cooking, she reached out without hesitation, holding my hand under cold water, her touch firm but gentle. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine for a moment, and I saw something there, something softer, something I had never thought she could feel for me. We didn't admit anything aloud, but our walls had begun to crumble. What had once been arguments turned into banter, and what had once been silence turned into late-night confessions whispered in the dark. I caught myself smiling when she walked into the room, not because she had done anything, but because her presence no longer felt like a burden. It felt like something I was learning to crave. And yet, I fought against it. Every time my heart leapt at her laugh, every time I felt warmth from her hand brushing against mine, I told myself it was a trick, a weakness I couldn't afford. She was still the woman I had been forced to marry. She was still the symbol of everything I had hated about my father's control. But no matter how much I tried to bury it, my heart kept moving toward her like a tide that refused to be stopped. One night, as rain pattered against the windows, we sat on the floor together surrounded by books we had pulled from the shelves. She read aloud from one of them, her voice calm, almost tender. I watched her lips move, watched the way her eyes softened when she looked at the words. Without realizing it, I was leaning closer, as though gravity itself had shifted. When she finished reading, silence wrapped around us again, but it was no longer empty. It was charged, alive, filled with something we didn't dare name. I met her gaze, and for a moment, neither of us looked away. My breath caught, my heart pounding, and I saw the same hesitation, the same yearning reflected back at me. She broke the moment first, standing abruptly and gathering the books, her cheeks flushed though she tried to hide it. But I knew. And she knew I knew. Something between us had changed forever. That night I lay awake, my body aching with confusion. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who dreamed of love and freedom, the one who believed her heart belonged to someone else. And then I thought of the woman lying inches from me, the woman I had once despised, the woman who now filled my chest with a warmth I couldn't deny. I realized with a kind of terror that my hatred had always been easier than this, because hatred demanded nothing, but love asked for everything. And though I was afraid, though I wanted to resist, I knew I was already slipping, already falling into something I couldn't undo. The change between us was no longer subtle. It hung in the air, thick and undeniable, filling the quiet moments with tension that was no longer hostile but something far more dangerous. I felt it when she brushed past me in the hallway, her shoulder grazing mine just enough to make my skin burn. I felt it when her eyes lingered on me for a second too long, when her laughter softened in a way that made my chest ache. I told myself not to read into it, not to let myself hope, but hope had already taken root. And with every passing day, it grew stronger, pushing against the walls I had built inside me. I fought it at first. I told myself this was a trick of loneliness, a desperate illusion my heart had created to survive in a life I hadn't chosen. I reminded myself of the bitterness we had shared, the arguments, the distance. I tried to remember that she was a symbol of my father's control, that being with her was proof of my own lack of freedom. But then she would do something small, leave a blanket over me when I fell asleep on the couch, or pour me tea without a word in the mornings, and the ground beneath me would shift. How could I hate her when she was the only one who saw me in this house? How could I keep telling myself I despised her when every day she was proving, without saying a single word, that she understood me in ways no one else ever had? The truth broke open one evening after another family dinner. We had sat through hours of forced smiles and shallow conversation, our fathers parading us like trophies of obedience. By the time we returned home, my skin was crawling with exhaustion and anger. I ripped off my earrings and threw them on the dresser, the clatter echoing in the room. She stood by the window, arms crossed, her face hard but her eyes burning with the same fury I felt. "Do you ever get tired of pretending?" I asked, my voice shaking. She turned to me, and something in her expression cracked. "I've been pretending my whole life," she said. "I don't even remember what it feels like to be real." The pain in her voice struck me harder than I expected. I had seen her pride, her sharpness, her fire, but never this, never her vulnerability. I don't know what came over me, but the words tumbled out before I could stop them. "I'm so tired of being trapped. I'm so tired of living a life that isn't mine." My voice broke, and I hated that she could hear the tremor in it. For a moment, I thought she would dismiss me, brush it off as weakness. Instead, she walked closer, her steps slow but certain, until she was standing just inches away. "You're not alone," she whispered. Those 3 words shattered something inside me. I had been carrying the weight of loneliness for so long that I didn't know what it meant to set it down, even for a moment. And yet here she was, telling me she carried it too. The silence between us grew heavy, but it wasn't the cold silence of before. It was electric, trembling with everything we couldn't say. I looked up at her, and our eyes locked. For once, I didn't look away. I let her see me, the fear, the anger, the longing. And in her gaze, I saw the same storm. My chest rose and fell quickly, my heart beating so loudly I was sure she could hear it. She reached out then, hesitant, her fingers brushing against mine. The touch was so light it could have been an accident, but it wasn't. It lingered, and with it came a flood of heat rushing through me. My throat tightened, my thoughts scattered. I wanted to pull back, to keep the walls up, but I couldn't. I didn't want to. Her hand slid into mine fully, and I felt the strength of her grip, firm yet trembling. It was the first time our touch wasn't forced, wasn't demanded by tradition or appearances. It was ours. Something raw and unspoken passed between us, something that had been waiting quietly beneath the surface, finally breaking free. She took a step closer, and suddenly there was no space between us. I could feel her breath against my skin, warm and uneven, just as unsteady as mine. For a long moment we stood there, caught between fear and desire, between defiance and surrender. And then, as though neither of us could bear the weight any longer, we closed the space completely. The kiss was hesitant at first, trembling, almost fragile, but it carried a desperation that had been building for months. It wasn't graceful or perfect, it was raw, a clash of pain and longing, of 2 people who had been taught to hide themselves finally daring to be seen. My chest ached with the force of it, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. When we pulled back, breathless and shaken, her forehead rested against mine. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The truth had already been spoken in the touch of our lips, in the trembling of our hands. That night, I lay in bed with her beside me, not as a stranger or an enemy but as something entirely different, something terrifying and beautiful. The air between us was no longer heavy with resentment. It was heavy with possibility. I knew this changed everything. I knew nothing would ever go back to the way it was. And though fear clawed at the edges of my heart, fear of my father, fear of the world, fear of what we had become, I also felt something else for the first time in years. I felt hope. The days after that night were different in ways that were impossible to ignore. The house, once suffocating, seemed to breathe with us. Every corner held echoes of what had happened, and every glance carried weight we no longer pretended wasn't there. We had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and though fear pulsed beneath my skin, the pull toward her was stronger than the dread. In the mornings, when I woke to find her lying beside me, the light of dawn soft against her face, I felt a strange peace I hadn't known in years. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from safety, it was the kind born from finally giving in to something my heart had longed for all along. We became careful, almost secretive in our affection, as if the walls around us had ears. In the daylight, we maintained the facade, still walking through the rituals of marriage expected of us. To outsiders, nothing had changed. But in the privacy of our home, in stolen glances and fleeting touches, we were writing a new story. When her hand brushed against mine as she set a cup of tea down, I felt a rush of warmth that lingered long after. When I caught her watching me across the table, the corners of her lips curved in the faintest, most unguarded smile, and I knew that something real had taken root between us. It wasn't all tender. There were arguments still, sharp words thrown in frustration, because love doesn't erase anger, it only deepens the places where it can hurt. But even in those moments, something had shifted. We no longer fought as enemies forced together but as people who cared enough to be wounded. When she raised her voice, I heard the pain of her own battles, not just disdain for me. And when I snapped back, she didn't walk away, she stayed, waiting for the storm to pass, as though she finally understood that I was not her rival but her equal in this cage we shared. The first time we were forced to appear in public again as the perfect couple, I thought the weight of pretense would crush me. We attended a formal gathering, the kind of event where eyes lingered too long and whispers carried quickly. My father's pride was on full display, introducing us as though our union were the crown jewel of his legacy. I braced myself for the familiar suffocation, for the mask I had worn so many times before. But then her hand slid into mine, steady and firm, and when I looked at her, I didn't see coldness or resentment. I saw solidarity. I saw her choosing to stand with me, not because we had to, but because she wanted to. When people praised us, when they commented on how radiant we looked together, for the first time, their words didn't feel like poison. Because for once, some part of it was true. On the ride home that night, the silence between us wasn't heavy. It was filled with something unspoken but undeniable. I leaned my head against the window, watching the blur of city lights, and felt her fingers find mine in the dark. No words passed between us, but that touch was enough. It told me we were no longer just surviving this marriage. We were beginning to live in it, to carve out something that was ours despite the way it had been forced upon us, and yet, beneath the warmth, fear still lingered. At night, when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I thought of my father. I thought of his anger, his need for control, the way he had built my entire life as a reflection of his will. What would he do if he knew the truth of what was blooming between us? The thought made my chest tighten. But then she would turn in her sleep, her arm brushing against me, her breath steady and warm, and for a moment, the fear would fade. Because no matter how terrifying the consequences might be, nothing felt more right than this. There was a night when the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. We lit candles, their glow soft and flickering against the walls. Sitting together on the floor, shadows dancing around us, she laughed softly at how quiet the world seemed without electricity. The sound of her laughter, unguarded and pure, made my heart ache in a way I couldn't describe. I found myself laughing too, not at anything in particular, but because being near her in that moment felt lighter than anything I had carried before. When the laughter faded, she looked at me, her expression serious, her eyes searching. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if maybe this was supposed to happen, even if it wasn't how we imagined?" My breath caught, because I had wondered. I had wondered if sometimes love came dressed as pain, if sometimes what we despised was the very thing meant to save us. I didn't answer her with words. Instead, I leaned in, and when our lips met again, it wasn't hesitant like before. It was sure, deep, filled with everything we hadn't dared to admit. Her hands pulled me closer, and I felt the walls I had built crumble completely. In her arms, I wasn't my father's pawn. I wasn't a prisoner of duty. I was simply myself, seen, wanted, alive. And in that moment, I realized I no longer dreamed of escaping alone. I dreamed of escaping with her. Still, the shadow of what lay ahead never left me. Even in the sweetness of her touch, the world outside our walls loomed, ready to punish us for daring to love. But for the first time in my life, the fear didn't outweigh the hope. Because love, fragile and forbidden as it was, had taken root where I least expected it. And no matter how much the world tried to control us, I knew that seed of love was something no one, not even my father, could take away. The morning everything shifted began quietly, almost deceptively so. The sun spilled through the curtains in soft golden streaks, the air carrying that gentle calm that makes you think the day will be ordinary. But beneath the quiet, there was a storm waiting. I woke to find her already dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed, her shoulders tense, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, but I could feel the weight of her thoughts pressing down on both of us. When I whispered her name, she turned to me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw fear written openly across her face. "They know," she said simply, her voice breaking. I didn't need to ask who. My father's shadow loomed over everything in my life. I could imagine the whispers, the watchful eyes, the way truth always had a way of slithering through the cracks of carefully built lies. My chest tightened, my stomach churned. In that moment, all the warmth we had built, all the fragile happiness we had discovered, felt like it was dangling on the edge of a knife. She looked at me as though waiting for me to tell her it would be fine, but the words lodged in my throat. I couldn't lie to her, not when the danger was so real. The day passed in a blur of dread. Every knock on the door made me flinch, every ring of the phone sent my heart racing. At dinner, my father's silence was louder than his words. He watched us, his gaze sharp and knowing, as though peeling back the layers of our carefully performed act. My appetite was gone, my hands trembled as I held my fork, but I forced myself to sit still, to endure. Across the table, she sat rigid, her face a mask of composure, but I could see the storm in her eyes. My father's smile was thin, cruel, the kind that carried threats wrapped in politeness. "Appearances," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the air, "are the foundation of power. When appearances falter, everything crumbles." He wasn't speaking of business. He was speaking of us. That night, behind closed doors, I collapsed into her arms, shaking with a mix of rage and terror. "He's going to destroy us," I whispered, my tears dampening her shirt. She held me tightly, her hand stroking my hair, her voice steady even as it cracked. "Then we won't let him. We've lived his life long enough. It's time we start living ours." Her words ignited something in me, a fire I hadn't dared to let burn before. For so long, I had believed I was powerless, that my life belonged to him. But in her arms, I began to realize that maybe power wasn't something given. Maybe it was something taken. The plan was born in whispers, in the quiet hours of the night when the house was still and only the sound of our hearts could be heard. We talked of leaving, of running away from everything, his control, the suffocating expectations, the endless charade. We spoke of places where no one knew our names, where love wasn't a crime but a truth we could hold openly. Fear clung to us, yes, but it no longer paralyzed me. It sharpened me. Every moment of cruelty, every demand my father had ever placed upon me, every time I had been silenced, all of it built into a resolve that I had never felt before. The final confrontation came sooner than I expected. My father summoned me to his study, the room that had always felt like the heart of his empire, lined with books and deals signed in shadows. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Do not think I am blind," he said coldly. "Whatever game you and that woman are playing ends now. His words sliced through me, but for the first time in my life, I did not bow my head. I met his gaze, my voice trembling but unbroken. This isn't your decision anymore. My life is mine. His face twisted in rage, his hand slamming against the desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot. But beneath my fear, there was freedom in finally saying the words I had buried for so long. That night, we packed. Not much, just enough to carry. Clothes, a few keepsakes, the smallest reminders of who we were beyond his grip. My hand shook as I folded each item, not from hesitation but from adrenaline. Every sound in the house felt like it could betray us. When she touched my shoulder, her eyes steady, her voice soft, she whispered, "It's not the things we take that matter. It's the life we're about to build." I nodded, holding back tears, because I knew she was right. We slipped out in the darkness, the city lights stretching like stars ahead of us. Each step away from that house felt like a step out of a prison I had lived in my entire life. The air was sharp against my skin, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. But when I looked at her, walking beside me, her hand tightly gripping mine, I knew I wasn't running away. I was running toward something. Toward freedom. Toward love. Toward the life we had chosen for ourselves, and though the fear of what might come still whispered at the edges of my mind, it no longer owned me. For the first time in my life, I was not my father's daughter, not his pawn, not his obedient shadow. I was myself. And I was hers. We had been forced into a marriage neither of us wanted, trapped in a cage built from control and appearances. But somewhere in the pain, in the bitterness, in the nights of silence and the moments of breaking, we had found each other. And in finding each other, we had found the courage to walk away. The night closed around us, but instead of darkness, I felt light. The path ahead was uncertain, and the world might never understand. But as long as she walked beside me, I knew I had finally stepped into a life that was truly, unapologetically, mine.